How's it going, everyone? It's time for a much belated question and answer video. I think I did one of these this year earlier, but I tried to do them once a month. I was actually trying to do them more than that because I was getting a whole lot of questions, but everything went crazy. So speaking of everything going crazy, well, first off, if you're new here or unfamiliar with how my format works, there's always timestamps in the video description, so I think that'll tie into YouTube's new little timeline thing, so you can skip the sections that you're not particularly interested in or go back and review things. Also, all my sport links are down there. Please, check them out and subscribe and all that stuff. Since everything's a mess and my setup's scattered at the moment, I'm just live streaming from my cell phone into OBS and then doing a thing in the background here. So sorry if there's edits and things like that. I also have a print going on in the background. There's people outside, yada, yada, yada. So sorry I have to do. Okay, so first section here is old news. First off, I'd like to thank all of the subscribers and Patreon supporters and things like that stuck around through all this. I know it's rough, and some of you have contacted me and said, man, I gotta decrease my donations or bug out for now. I said that's fine. With everything going on in the world, I totally understand that you can't throw some random guy on the internet $10 a month. Hopefully, when things get a little bit more normal, which they are slowly but surely, we can get back on track with this channel, start pumping out regular content and get those numbers up. Those are rookie numbers. But anyway, thanks for those who stuck around. Those who haven't temporarily or whatever, I completely understand too. So as soon as the splint came off and things opened up, I kind of hit the ground running with all that. I have projects going on all over the place, just trying to play catch up. So now it's Q&A time, and this is where I go through the YouTube comments and ostensibly Patreon comments and emails and messages and all that kind of thing, and just take a random sampling of things, just scrolling through, and also finding things that I earmarked to sort of give a further talking to the community. Now there were a few things, and unfortunately I couldn't find this one. I think it was a Patreon comment where it was something about why we can't do something in Marlin firmware, and I was like, too many words for a message, I'll have to hit it in a Q&A. Unfortunately, I can't find that, so you know who you are. Re-ask me again, and I'll try to hit on that. Man, I wish I remember what it was. Anyway, let's get to it. So, what I'm going to do here, as you see, I have my face right here, so I can virtual look at you lovelies, and then just screen capturing the channel comments thing behind, and you know how much I hate the channel comments thing. Hopefully I don't have to chop this up too much, as long as nobody put dirty words or anything in the comments. We should be okay. Okay, let's start at the top from DIY lobotomy. This is about the ball bearing trick. So you can see, here's the video in reference over here, here's the comment over here, blah blah blah. This is about the ball bearing trick. Now that was referring to if you had alignment problems on your ender, but really any other printer that uses a situation where you don't have a bearing pillow supporting the weight and you're just using the bearings in the motor shaft, or you have a Acme rod that's a little bit bent or wonky or something like that, or skewed off at an angle, you can just drop a ball bearing inside and it'll kind of pivot on that and make things so that it at least doesn't bind up. So yeah, DIY lobotomy says, this is a must, what an amazing difference, blah 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 blah. I've had issues with Z banding regarding numerous adjustments. No more, sir, you were a legend. I'm glad that helped you out. Yeah, the response to that video, a lot of people were like, what, why? And then other people were like, oh my god, this is the best thing ever. So this is for the oh my god, this is the best thing ever people that have really been banging their head against a wall trying to fix it. Just stumbled across your channel, hope blah 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 blah, thank you. Okay, planned obsolescence. This is from the failing Omron switch problem. If you recall that video, it was just one I put out because of my frustrations with how modern mice are working when you're moving to lower voltage, lower current, and not compensating with properly designed switches. So yeah, Golden Rule asked planned obsolescence, saying about the switches, running at the lower current, particularly with the wireless and the light speed sensors and all that kind of stuff. They fail prematurely because of the various reasons that I went through in that 45-minute video or whatever. But yes, I do believe that is the planned obsolescence. There was actually, and I mentioned this before, some engineers that worked on various Logitech mice back in the day that said the people that cranked the numbers were yelling at them because the mice were just too rugged. Actually, I mean, I think it was actually one of these three mice. It was either this guy, the G500, or this guy, the old G5 laser mouse, or this guy, which is the MX518, the battle armor one or whatever. I think it was one of those where they were like, these last way too long. We need people to buy new mice every couple years. Well, yeah, that's a kind of a sneaky way that you can do it, is when your switches fail, when they're not actually failed, they're actually perfectly fine, but they're running below spec, so it greatly decreases their capacity. Like, can they click fine 50 million times? Yeah, sure they can, but not at those current levels. Greg Jenkins on the reviewing the sucky linear rail. Oh, about the cheap linear rail I got in the interim. And this was months ago, and in some of the Endermod videos I might talk about this, but these are the kind of improved cheapy digital rail, linear rail, and yeah, I've had this sitting around for a couple months now. These are much better than the ones I got for that review, and they were around the same price, like a couple bucks more, but I think this was like, I don't know, 13, 14 bucks, whereas the ones in the video were like the $8 super blowout Uber AliExpress cheapies. Still no preload on this, and consequently, if you're in the market for these, there's some confusion if you look in the comments where people are actually complaining. They order the ones with preload and then they complain that it doesn't move freely like they see these guys in the videos. You actually want the ones with preload, especially if it's just a single axis supported. Otherwise you get weird resonance problems like I had with the DIY livestream printer bed, and I had to put a pre-tensioner using a wheel on there. But anyway, so I was trying to find the ones with the preload, which, like I said, are the ones that you want, but so many people complain about them binding just because they didn't move as well, not binding consequently, it's just what preload does, that it's hard to find them now because they got the nasty reviews and all that stuff, and they're like, well, we'll just sell the floppy ones then. So yeah, those are those situations where people in the comments and they think they're doing something good with peer reviewing and warning people off and actually make it worse. Anyway, Greg Jenkins says, I use Royal Purple Motor Oil in my skate bearings. Once the factory grease wears off, it works very well, but I have to disassemble and re-oil more frequently. Yeah, if you use something that doesn't have the stick-to-itiveness of the heavyweight oils or the lightweight greases, you will have to do it more often, but they do move smoother if that's what you're interested in, with less damping. Also, a note on cleaning, the best would be to sonicate everything. Yeah, well, using acetone, methanol, alcohol, and water, of course. Yeah, that would be ideal, but not everybody can do that. Okay, more on the failing Omron switches. For those looking to replace a broken mouse switch, here are the best Omron model that fit the form factor. D2F01 and D2F01F. The latter has less actuation force. Yeah, the D2F01F are the ones that let me see, this is on a mouse leash. The ones that I put in my G502, and they've been going strong ever since. It's worked pretty great. Like I said, I have I forget which one is which. Yeah. So anyway, I tried out two different switches in here. One was the Honeywell switch, and one was the Japanese Omron. They're both working fine. Consequently, for Christmas, I got, let's see if I can get this on camera, one of these with the Hero Sensor G502 SEs, and those switches already went bad. So my problem with G900 was partially due to switch failure and partially corroded contact inside the mouse. Yeah, that's another thing that I think I mentioned in that video. It doesn't matter if you make the switches out of the best stuff in the world, if you have them, either the completed PC boards or the switch components or the switches themselves, sitting in bins that are, open to the air, and you happen to be in a place where there's a lot of sulfuric type sulfur oxide fog. That's not great, especially if they're silver contacts, like a lot of the non-Japanese Omrons are. The 50 million billion cycle like gaming ones that uses like a silver alloy contact, and like sulfur makes that ages that very quickly. Let me see. Continuing. The solution to chatter seems simple to me. If only the logic control would utilize all 3 pins instead of 2. Let me explain. Yeah, that is a I don't know if I have a switch accessible. No, I don't know where my switches ran off to, but those are just on-off switches. So you're just pulling, you're toggling between low state and high state to a digital pin, just telling it, hey, we're clicked or we're not clicked. But there's actually 3 terminals in each of theirs. One is it's listed as no contact, so you have like the yes and a no, and then the floaty one that you can tie into it because you have the contact that bounces ostensibly between like on and off and on and off. Sometimes this doesn't exist though, but in the switches that are the switches that have the 3 contacts, you could theoretically, instead of like debouncing this or worrying about current, just say, hey, until you get an off signal, it's considered to be on. Like that fixes the drag problem. There are other problems with that in terms of like debouncing both contacts, as well as the fact that a lot of those switches only have the good contact for the on and not the off and that type of thing. But yeah, it could be done. You would have to be careful about like the design and selection. Drac Blue says, I tried to like the video, but my mouse double clicked and I unliked. Let me see. Any popular mice with Japanese Omron switch inside that you guys can recommend? I can't think of any off the top of my head, but this is not an unknown issue, so you probably find something like that on Reddit. You are really the mouse man. Good job. Let me see. Put a motor sleeve on it. Oh, for the ball bearing trick thing, Roy Brown says, put a sleeve on the motor shaft. That is a thing that you can do, and I have actually done that for other things. I think what he's talking about is in terms of, I think he's talking about like the as opposed to a pillow block. Now let me grab a motor. Okay, rando motor. This is a Mineba Motor Manufacturing Company, so this probably came out of like an old printer or something like that. So you have the shaft going on here, and they are rated or not rated to take various types of loads. So you have loads going this way, loads going this way, etc., etc. So depending on, and you can see this motor move up and down a little bit because of the retaining string that sort of push the things up. Obviously, like if you overcome the rating of the compression string, you're going to down like that. Also, you can deflect this by putting a load on it higher than the operating specs, and you get imprecision, and you get other problems as well, like the bearings wearing out and whatnot. One thing you can do is drop a bearing right here and clamp your coupling against that. And that will give you a much higher radial bearing or radial load rating, especially if you have like a particularly budget type of a stepper. So I think that's what he's talking about. I don't know if I mentioned that in the video or not, but I have done that with other testing here. Hopefully testing that I will make a video for soon. Fingers crossed. Mario Ilpi says, thanks for the powerful video. One question is becoming more and more pushing into my mondo. Do you see the couplers of the Genius Artillery? They are Oldham style. What do you think about it? I have not seen the Genius Artillery, but for those of you who don't know, Oldham style couplings are 3-piece or more than 3-piece. Usually a 3-piece type of a coupling where you have the coupling on the motor, the coupling on the shaft, or the 2 shafts or whatever you're joining together. And then there's an intermediate piece in the middle that can slide along like X and Y planes. That's for if you have not parallel misalignment. Anyway, if you're misaligned like this, that will help even it out. It also, for like high RPMs, it helps a little bit with that more because you don't have as much whipping action. It changes into a sliding action. I have not tried those out on 3D printers, so I can't really comment about it. I mean, they're a great design if you're assuming misalignment or if you require high RPMs. So yeah, I guess time and testing will tell with that. Let me see. GHB says, this is on the failing Omron switches. Hello, I have a Logitech G502 Hero that have an unclicking problem where the mouse can sometimes, I think, release the left click button when I actually didn't. Yeah, this causes annoying like dragging and sudden drop. Like I said, I have the Hero as well, and developed issues within like 1 season of Diablo. So yeah, that is failing switch problem. I have not pulled this apart. I want to get more wear on it first. I have not pulled that apart to see if it's like the switch is fine, or if it's like some of the switches that I pulled out of my old gaming mice where the actual contact wasn't hitting great and it sort of buckled and skewed and went off to the side like that. So time will see, but yeah, that is a symptom of the failing switches. 2905, what collar are you using? Rulin from Granger. Thanks for the useful info in the video. I don't remember. I think he's talking about the wider heavy duty collar. I don't remember where I got that from. I don't think it was from Granger, although we have a Granger here. I don't go to it as much. Might be from McMaster Carr. Ender 3 alignment problems and solutions. I was thinking of doing this. Thank you. You saved me a world of time. Warranty void, sanity back in check. I think he's referring to the drill a single hole to solve all the problems of the Ender alignment things. By the way, like they have the new Ender, Pro or whatever it is, Ender 2. Is that what they're calling it? And I was hoping that they would have watched that video and said, we can solve all these engineering problems by drilling one single hole, but they didn't. So I don't know if it's back to the song and the dance with aligning the gantry and all that stuff. But yeah, for me, if I end up getting an Ender V2, which who knows, the single hole method is the way to go. Okay, about the desuckifying an SM57 clone. Great video on a 57, great comparison. One thing that comments on that a transformer is not necessarily needed for a mic to be balanced. The mic element is already the intended impedance, no transformer required. There have been a very few pro dynamic mics that have been such. Blow a thumbs up. Yes, Bob H, that is true, because I was going to draw a thing, but yeah, cardioid mics with dynamic cardioid. Doesn't matter if they're cardioid or not. Dynamic mics are just a coil, so it's naturally floating. So as long as you don't have one side that is inherently grounded to chassis or something like that, yeah, it is going to inherently be balanced. You could just run that right out to your an XLR cable, and then have the chassis ground be the grounding shield mesh and going out the other side. On the SKR Mini V1.2 testing with extra memory. Oh yes, this was the writing onto the extended memory that exists in some of those chips. Could you make a step-by-step guide to checking the flash size on the board with an ST-Link? Edit, to check if a chip is actually working 512 or a defective 512 with unusable bytes has been rebranded to 256K. Could I make a step-by-step guide? The problem with a lot of the step-by-step guide type things is that I work with that type of stuff, particularly like microcontrollers in Unix-like systems. So I could make a step-by-step guide, but it would be for like Mac OS in the terminal or Linux in the terminal, since you're using you're using the exact same tools in both ways. As far as like Windows, I don't do any work on that stuff in Windows unless I absolutely have to use like the baked in like ST tools or ST microelectronics tools. I'll think about it. I'll think about it. There are plenty of sources out there for that, but yeah, if some of this stuff comes up again and I have to set up all the debugging and whatnot, I'll do that. Failing mouse switch part 2 teardown and testing. Anyone knows if all these switches are plug and play, the same dimensions as the Omron D2 FCFK? They're the same. They're the same dimensions, but all switches have different actuation points, and some of the switches have slightly larger bodies, which becomes a problem on certain mice. Depends how the mice are manufactured, and it's like fractions of a millimeter or a millimeter or something like that. But that's enough that on some mice it makes the plastic actuator button rest against it so that it can actuate when you don't want it to, type of a deal. But it was only very particular mice that had that problem, so you might want to check like Reddit or something like that, where people are doing these swaps, and make sure you're, if you have X mouse and you want to try Y switch, like the Japanese ones or something like that, double check with them to see if anyone did it and they don't fit properly. From the older Part 3 32-bit 3D printing series boards, Charles Reich says, not studying board design and differences carefully, but how does BTT BQ come into such heavy presence in the last 2 years? Have you done any videos on that since this video? Is revisiting this list on state of 32-bit boards address warranted? Yeah, probably. My big push was just getting us into 32-bit, because that 8-bit was just a shackle on our legs, as far as like moving things forward, not in terms of anything inherent about 8-bitedness and 32-bitedness, but in terms of like all the other tech that goes into those microcontrollers that you can make use of that are still haven't worked their way into like the firmwares, and using like different timer peripherals and CAN bus and all that kind of like interconnectedness of multiple MCUs and things like that. Yeah, revisiting it might be good. I'm gonna be doing a video on like Ender mods I did during the lockdown, and I swapped out the board a couple times. I actually purposely fried a board for all of you, so I have to do that video because I sacrificed a board for you. But I'll talk a little bit more about it there. It's tough to do without getting really nerdy. See, back in like the 8-bit days, basically everyone was using like the Atmel stuff. So it was an even playing field, and when you were talking about one board versus the other, you knew that the brain of the board, the microcontroller, was the same thing. So all the digital nonsense and firmware was the same thing, basically. And you didn't have to work about like timings and like which peripheral works off of like which clock and which, subdivisions of blah, 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 and which pins are interruptible and which ones aren't, and, that all that kind of nonsense, because it could be done differently from, one chip to another, to a series, to different manufacturers, and, ST versus NXP and all that stuff. So it becomes much more complicated to do. And I am more familiar with like the STM32 chips because they're in absolutely freaking everything, and I use them for absolutely freaking everything. Chances are you have one in your computer mouse, But when it comes to like other boards, like when I did a review of the rearm board, I never really got to the part 2 because there were some goofy things with the firmware relating to the NXP chips that were on there, and the way that they handled like caching and acceleration, things like that were just making things all screwy. Plus like the interruptible pins were taken up by other slots, and like those were kind of niche use cases, and it got so complicated that I was like, well, I would have to talk about the difference between like NXP and ST and like the SAMD chips, and lose everybody in the process. And so it got frustrating and bloated enough that I just like, I'm just gonna have to pull the plug on this for right now until I can figure out how to streamline it a little bit. But yeah, about the desuckifying the SM57 clone, why does the mod sound better to me? Great research and informative video, man. Thank you very much. Yeah, the mod, as far as, like I've used those modified cheapy $8 mics since then, and they don't sound, like I said in the video, they don't sound, it doesn't make them sound like an SM57, it makes them sound like a decent mic, and I compared it a little bit more to like the Audix, dynamic handheld mics. But they do have kind of a crispier high end and a little bit of a mid-range scoop, which makes them sound a little more, hi-fi or chiseled. Might be a little like, harsh sounding to people who are used to that, the Shure upper mid-range bump for the SM57s, 58s. But yeah, it's definitely usable. Improving printed PLA parts with booze. David Mulligan. David, were you the one who asked me that question that I can't think of? I think it was. Ask again, please, if you do. Alex, have you looked at the Tusk or Bird air pipe cooling gizmos? They are metal tools with holes drilled in them. Both designs look easy enough for some home users. Basically what they are is you have an air pump as opposed to a fan blowing air, and they're pumping that through a tube and into some bent metal tubing with holes drilled in it, so you can get the metal tubing so that you can get it right down near the nozzle, and then the holes so that you can get it very directed. So that works on, as opposed to airflow, there's still air flowing, but as opposed to like trying to not interrupt the airflow or keeping like airflow laminar or regulating it with the speed of the fan or something like that, it's using like basically a compressor. And the problem is I'm in an apartment here, so I have a whole box of like air compressors that I could try out. The problem is compressors are really loud. So I mentioned this, I think, in the part 1 of the fan video. Probably the ultimate way to do it, like we do everything in workshops, is with compressed air. The problem is the compressor and the noise and the maintenance and the hoses and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's something I'll have to look into. But even just running like the quietest compressor I have, which is like an airbrush compressor, a little tiny thing with a little tiny couple liter tank on it, like that's loud enough that you know, it annoys the wife and the neighbors and all that. I've also... This was some of the stuff that I shot in the video and lost, like messing around with DIY like cpap blowers. So like technically this is a compressor, but let me hook this up so you see how loud it is. And that's running at half speed. That's about 10,000 RPM. This will do like 20,000 RPM. So yeah, messing with a couple of these designs in December or January or something like that. Maybe after that. And then I did some that were adopted from like respirator projects for the COVID stuff. But getting them quiet is an issue. But yeah, looking into all that stuff, trying to figure out the most reasonable things to do, or times that I could do unreasonable things, like, you know, big loud air compressors and stuff like that. Yeah, in answer to your question, yeah, they work. A lot of them, they don't put out the volume of air of a fan, so if you need something that's like a larger volume, maybe a hybrid between that and like another fan. Another problem is also regulating the flow of air. I don't know how they handle that, like maybe with a solenoid and a ball valve, a ball cutoff valve or something like that. I'm not sure, but that would, or not a solenoid, a servo, and a ball cutoff valve tied into the firmware somehow. I suppose you could do that. But yeah, as you can tell, I obviously haven't looked at it in depth, but I have looked at it in theory. And I will check out that type of a setup. About the TMC 2130 wine, advanced troubleshooting for stubborn steppers. Benny Jackson says, having trouble with layer shift running at 24 volts, check belt, linear rod, and screw. The problem is with the TMC 2130 driver, I believe. Will this help? Not sure what I put in there that may or may not help. Unfortunately, like with those types of things, unless you know the whole setup, is really tough to help with it. If they're not overheating and skipping, and it's not a firmware problem, and it's not a microcontroller problem, then you could just be feeding it too much current, so that when you go into like turns, it's going temporarily into current shut off and shifting, and then catching up with itself again, and then you have a layer shift. I had a problem with the TMC 2130s doing that. Because they don't push nearly as much current as like the TMC 2209s or something like that. So you're always sort of running them on the ragged edge of both like thermals and like regular current. And yeah, so that goes back to the trinamic torture test shapes and things like that. But yeah, make sure you're using enough current but not too much current. And it's possible that you are using either a very heavy gantry of some kind. It's really tough to know without seeing it. So let me see. This is for the behind the scenes TMC 2099 testing. Okay, Hobby Rob says, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my GTT SKR E3 DIP V1.2 running. Are you able to make a video for that? I tried to copy this video, but unfortunately I got errors. Probably because of my mistake in the language barrier. I saw, by the way, you have a V1.0 and a 1.1. Which board should you choose the software? Right now, I actually, in my Ender currently, I have a SKR E3 DIP V1.0, and that's working absolutely fine. I think I have a 1.1 up there, but no, maybe not. Maybe I could do a setup for that. I'll have to check. I get errors probably because I don't know what your errors are, Rob, but I could probably put up a video for it, but I'll have to dig it out. I haven't changed that firmware in a few months. But yeah, well, I can tell you that it does indeed work. So actually, you know what? I had to do some modifications on that board to get the 20. Did you say you're using 2209s? Well, you didn't, but I'm going to assume that to get the 2209s working. So yeah, maybe I will put out a video for that. That might be dated though, because this is the older board. This is about the SKR Mini V1.3 actually having 512K of RAM. Wizacall1 says, "Hi, I plan to change the chip to RET6 on SKR Mini E3. The standard bootloader is able to write firmware more than 256K. Opinions are divided on the internet. Have you flashed SKR with SD?" Yeah, I do. I flash all my SKRs with the SD card. That's just the way I do it. It's just so much easier. Plan on changing the chip, so you're going to physically solder a different chip on there. The standard bootloader is able to write the firmware on. Opinions are divided on the internet. Yeah, here's the problem. There are a couple different versions of the SKR bootloader out there. And unfortunately, I don't have the code, and I've squawked about this a couple times, but what a lot of these places that work with the STM32 chips do overseas, they don't have in-house people that do that type of like low-level stuff, like bootloaders and like real low-level firmware. So they'll send out a contract to have somebody do it, and they get the finished binary as opposed to like all the source. So even though like technically that would all have to be open sourced, and technically they're using all of ST's tools and their files to do this, and then just editing, you know, as needed. They just don't have it available to post, which is kind of annoying. So it's tough to answer that question, because all I can give you is anecdotal evidence and say on all of my firmware, or on all of my chips, it has been able to address more than 256 kilobytes of firmware. But I did also see those reports of people who said you can't. And I did actually run into, not on that particular board, but on other 3D printing boards, 256K chips that actually only have 256K on them. Like, I couldn't force it into more memory. The banks just physically weren't there, or weren't hooked up, or were lazed out, or whatever. So yeah, it really depends. Unfortunately, I don't know what bootloader's on there, so I can't answer that. But in answer to your question, yes, there are earlier bootloaders that do not address fully, just because of the way that the memory stacks are written to be addressed from the firmware, and then there's other stuff that does. And consequently, I've gone back and forth with a few different people about like the bootloader stuff and working toward like an open bootloader, and I will have to look if I do end up doing that board review. I'll have to go and look and see if these bootloaders are working, because like Mod Mike whacked one together from the Physetic code, a bootloader for like their SD bootloader, and there are things like, you know, OpenBLT that exist too, that I've put on some of these boards. The problem with that is like it's open source, but it's unsupported, and there's no forums, and they want you to pay for, you know, troubleshooting and things like that. So it was like a lot of fumbling and trial and error, and it didn't work a lot of the time, and so whatever. But if somebody can work out like an OpenBLT, like small memory space bootloader for these, you know, like SKR boards, like that would be great. Let me see. Oh, improving PLA printed parts with booze. Crunch69 says, PLA releases lactic acid during exposure to 50% pure alcohol, causing crystallization. Way back in 2016, concurrent solvent-induced crystallization and hydrolytic degradation of PLA by water ethanol solutions. Let me Google that. Cool. So I just took a peek at the paper that Crunch69 posted. I hadn't seen that one, but it has some nifty charts and figures. I'm going to do a follow-up. Actually, I already did a follow-up to the PLA alcohol crystallization with this fun gizmo and a couple other things, and some ideas for future work and that sort of thing. But the long and the short of it is, in answer to my own question during that video, yes, it is a thing. It's not super pronounced, but probably useful. So yeah, I will do that follow-up as soon as I am able to, do more editing, and I will read through that paper. And I did find the initial paper from, it wasn't as far back as 2016, it was a couple years ago, that has a lot of facts and figures that sort of agreed with what I did. They got much better responses than I did, so I don't know what I was doing wrong. But regardless, that means that somebody doing things properly can get better results, and I'll roll that into the second video. So yeah, thanks Crunch69, I'll check out that paper. On the Pocket 100 megahertz oscilloscope testing part 3, Thomas P says YouTube translation has problems with my English. I try to speak as properly as possible. The problem is I do speak very quickly, and I try to slow myself down as best I can. Another problem is when you're talking about like the automatic translations, it doesn't pick up on technical terms very well. It tries to translate it into like sort of common English, and I imagine translating that into another language as well would add another layer of difficulty to it. So yeah, a lot of the problems with the translation are just, if I say something like permeability, you can see if maybe that comes up with it or maybe it doesn't. Or some even, hydrolytic, is that going to come up? Let me see. Oh, this is going way back to the Ramps Plus Duo mod part 1. I'd actually want to use a ramps with a new Adafruit GrandCentral Station SAMD 51 megaboard. Also, it might be easier to buy an unpopulated ramps board and just install the correct parts for 3.3 volt operation. You can buy a bare spare from OS Edge Park. Yeah, I purposely have not bought the GrandCentral yet because I really want to work with it. It's basically, for you who don't know, I think it's an M4 Cortex SAMD, but whatever. In a Arduino Mega form factor, which is pretty nice because it's kind of meant as like a drop-in replacement for like mega projects. I know there are, I think, Marlin presets for the M4 GrandCentral or Grand Station, or I think it's just called GrandCentral, but I haven't tried it yet. And yes, it might be easier to like get it on. Actually, I have. This is what he's talking about. Unpopulated ramps board. So this is a ramps board that has never been rampified. I have a couple of these, and yeah, I have used these in the past. The problem with like the 1.4 versions and going forward is that a lot of this is surface mount. So while doing the through components, like the headers and the resistors and that type of thing, is one thing. It's really annoying to solder like the little surface mount resistors and LEDs, and surface mount capacitors are particularly annoying to solder by hand. Or you could solder paste it and do it in a toaster oven or something like that. But whether or not that is less hassle, I don't know. I guess you'll have to make that evaluation for yourself. I think it's probably easier to just get it with most of the stuff put on there and swap off what you don't need, but that's just me. Going way back to the Trinamic Silent Step Stick Torque Curve Testing and TMC 2208 How-To. Jimmy Gerard says, this was super handy for my MPC and C setup. Glad it helped you. Moving to machining aluminum. I wish I had the space to be able to machine aluminum here, but unfortunately I'm in an apartment. Trying to get as many power without losing so much resolution, and really want to use sensorless homing. Now I set them to quarter with stealth chop and have plenty of power. Yeah, that was my preferred setup for a long time, especially back with like 8-bit stuff where you were limited to 10,000 pulses a second in Marlin without going to like double and quad stepping that confused the Trinamic drivers. Going to quarter stepping and then letting their internal interpolation tables make up the difference. The world's jankiest DIY water-cooled hot end, but it works. The Wobbly Emily says, I wonder if you can make one with greased O-rings and 3D printed shell for a stock head end. Yeah, you can. There might actually be kits for it. There were some people that did that with some lengths of silicone tubing, or it may have just been like high pressure tubing or something like that fit right over the standard E3D, and then put little couplings on it and O-rings at the top and the bottom. So yeah, it is definitely possible. It'd be nice if I could buy a block of aluminum and tap a heat break thread into it and make 2 holes for water. Let me show you something. This is a setup like you're talking about. Let me see if I can do this without spilling water all over the place. Oh, here we go. I'm going to do a video on this. Actually, I already did a video on this. I just haven't edited it yet because of the whole... more Omron switch stuff. Dan Smith says, from one Alex to another. What's up, Dan Alex? From one nerd to another. Yes, I spotted it. Thing you said deliberately. Did I pass the test? Do you have the SKU of the Panasonic switch that you would like to replace these Omron cheapies with? I'll do it. Unfortunately, the Panasonic switches, I think I got them. I just got them from Mauser. It was either Mauser or DigiKey, but they had like 4 left, and I bought them all. So I don't know if they're going to restock them or not. But I'll have to pull up that someday. I'm going to make another one of these videos with like updated stuff, because switch manufacturers actually have paid attention to both my squawking and other people squawking about this, and with a lot of folks moving to like, you know, like optical switches and HAL switches and things like that, the mechanical switch makers are paying attention and saying, oh yeah, we screwed up. So there are actually some logic level switches out there that'll work with like 3.3-ish on paper. I haven't tried any of them, but I'm going to wait for like the 2nd generation of that and then revisit the whole thing and maybe make some kind of rig like I wanted to test them before, particularly after my, you know, G502 crap the bed after like a month. Fancy Bowden couplings and fake tubing test. Alexander Ackhorn says, I'd love to know your retraction settings. I'm using cap tubing and I'd like to dial it back from 4. I think I had the retraction settings in that video. After was it the hydraulic couplings video? I don't remember. But with the actual Capricorn tubing and the hydraulic couplings, I got it down like almost to direct extruder levels, like under 2 millimeters. Obviously I adjust that depending on like temperature and filament and like from print to print, but yeah, real low. Unfortunately, right now I had to swap away from the hydraulic couplings back to like the pneumatic couplings, because I was doing a lot of swapping out for testing that I was doing with the hot ends over the quarantine period. So that should all make it into a video eventually. More improving printed PLA parts with booze. Very curious to know if by substituting ethanol by IPA would be a working solution. Have you thought of trying that? P.S. Glad you're back. I missed your ramblings. Yeah, isopropanol doesn't have the same effects, and I don't. Unfortunately, none of it's available so that I could do a test to show you, but hopefully someday isopropyl alcohol will be back on the market again. Talking about the Ramps 505 stepper drivers. Nico says, I've driven a stepper through a H-bridge with a PWM timer, no G-code, just a simple test. Technically, I could output microsteps. I was just calculating sine and cosine and giving results to hardware timer with some extra logic. Basically, one notation. Skipping. Yeah, I think the way that like Trinamic and those folks do the finer microstepping is pre-calculating and putting it on a lookup table, and then writing the lookup table to the driver's internal firmware. So you have to worry about, you know, the calculations, because, you know, sine cosine calculations at real time with 8 bajillion steps a second is, yeah, it's pretty heavy duty overhead. And you can consequently write your own custom pre-calculated stepper tables to Trinamic chips as well, which I'm doing a thing. I'm doing a thing with another person. Maybe that will make it into a video. We'll have to see. Talking about overclocking the STM32 in the Arduino IDE. Draco says, wow, excellent video. I'm from Mexico. My question is if it works for any board. It works for any board that they have. All I did in that video was show you how you could do the overclocking without having to write everything from scratch, like setting up all the prelim stuff. All of that is part of the libraries that are linked or that are pulled into your Arduino IDE or Platform YO, whatever it is that you're using. So you can just kind of like go to those headers, find those headers for the boards, pull them into your project, and then overwrite them. Or sorry, overwrite is not a particularly C++y term, but anyways. So you can, yes, do that with any board. Whether or not you have to set up all of the timers from scratch is dependent on whether they have that intermediate board, which you would have to go and search for. I think I had the location of the folders from the least version of Arduino IDE that I used for that video in that video. So just take a peek and see if they're already pre-done for your board. A like feels weak to reflect how useful this information is and how much I enjoy these videos. Thanks, man. Thank you, Joseph. Ender 3 alignment problems. SBA 230 says, another testing thing is the position of the eccentric nut. When adjusting the wheel, you can have the nut looking up or down. This affects where the wheel is touching the rail relative to the other two. I noticed this when I tried to align the X gantry, and one of the outer wheels more loose than the others. I made them so that looking the other way, now all 6 wheels seem to be right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I really don't like that whole eccentric nut thing. For my DIY printers, I don't use those eccentric nuts. I have, well, I'll have to do that in a different video. But they're carts that bolt completely through it, as opposed to pressuring from the side with an eccentric nut. The problem is, like, the eccentric nuts are just so easy to use, and you can use the wheels in like a cantilevered setup from like a gantry. So, but yeah, it is messy. Okay, Sheikh Tashdid Ahmed asked 2 different questions. One was asking if they could fix a problem with polling rate, and another was asking about the different switch ratings. Sienna actually answered both those questions correctly. So yeah. Yeah, Sienna did a really good job of like kind of summarizing everything that I rambled on. The question was, will the polling rate affect like the double click issue? Probably not. It's probably, by the time you notice it, significant enough that you've already passed the firmware's debouncing routine, and then you're into intermittent contact territory. Particularly like the click and drag thing. It can possibly theoretically help on the if you're just having double clicks, but it's easy enough to try. Like, bump it down to the native polling rate of 8 kilohertz, 125 microseconds or whatever, or the packet rate of USB, and then try bumping it up from there and seeing if there's a difference. It's only like, microseconds, milliseconds though, so it's not like it's going to magically cure it. And then as far as like the pull-up stuff, if you look at Sienna's post, the problem is they're using the internal pull-ups inside the chip instead of external pull-ups of the correct value, so you're just not getting the proper, wetting and cleaning current and things like that. So it's not that the switches go bad, it's just that if you're not running them under the proper conditions, you're never going to even meet the minimum operating specs unless you're using like a precious metal on the top, like some of the gold switches like in the Japanese Omrons or something like that, which have a lower mechanical life but electrical life, particularly at those low power levels. Current and voltage seems to be much higher, as my mouse will attest. Okay, I'm going to have to end it there because, as you can hear, my voice is starting to fade. Sorry about the ones I couldn't get down to, but this is from, the last several months. Thanks for sticking around this long. Hope that was informative. Like I said, things do seem, fingers crossed, Murphy's Law be damned, seem to be getting back more close to normal, that I feel comfortable doing this stuff. So like I said, I have tons of footage that was recorded when my hand was all wonky and I couldn't do any editing, so I just have to dump that into project files and hammer into something that makes any sense. So I'm going to get on. And until then, get out there and make something awesome.